Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, love, and life's unexpected twists. Today's story follows James Weston, a billionaire whose life is forever changed when a brave woman named Kayla saves him. This emotional journey explores legacy, love, and what truly defines a family. In the towering skyline of New York City, James Weston sat in his office, staring blankly out at the sea of steel and glass that sprawled beneath him. The noise of the bustling city, its energy, its ambition, felt distant, as though it belonged to a life he no longer recognized. At 44, James had everything he thought he ever wanted: power, influence, and a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest in the country. Yet, there he was, a hollow man staring at his reflection in the window, feeling as though the weight of the world pressed against his chest. The phone call from Dr. Klein, his fertility specialist, echoed relentlessly in his mind. "Mr. Weston, I'm afraid the results are conclusive. You're sterile." "I'm sorry." Two simple words, "you're sterile," had unraveled him. For years, James had poured himself into building an empire, a legacy he dreamed of passing on to his future children. Children who would now never exist. It wasn't just the absence of heirs that troubled him. It was the loss of purpose. The realization that all he had built meant nothing if no one would carry it forward. He tried to argue with Dr. Klein, offering to fund new treatments, research, anything that might give him hope. "There are things money cannot change, Mr. Weston," the doctor had said softly, and James had slammed the phone down, unable to listen to more. That evening, rain lashed against the city streets as James drove aimlessly, his mind spiraling deeper into hopelessness. The world outside blurred through the windshield, a mess of lights and shadows. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he replayed moments from his past. Success after success, deal after deal. Yet none of it mattered now. He pressed his foot harder against the gas pedal, feeling the car surge forward. It happened in a heartbeat. The road curved, slick with rain, and the car skidded. The tires screamed against the pavement. For a brief moment, there was nothing but blinding light and the sound of crushing metal. Then silence. When James opened his eyes, the world was hazy, his vision clouded by smoke and pain. The crumpled dashboard loomed in front of him, and he realized he was trapped. Panic clawed at his chest as he heard the faint crackling of fire growing somewhere behind him. He tried to move, to free himself, but his body refused to respond. For the first time in years, James Weston, the man who controlled everything, felt utterly powerless. Then she appeared. A voice, urgent and calm, broke through the chaos. "Stay with me. Don't close your eyes." Through the smoke, a woman emerged, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She wasn't wearing a uniform, nor did she look like a trained rescuer. She was just a person, a stranger who had stopped when everyone else drove past. Her hands worked quickly, prying at the twisted door with a strength James hadn't expected. "We need to get you out now," she said, her voice steady. James tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. All he could do was watch as she fought to free him. Her dark hair clung to her face, soaked from the rain, but her expression never wavered. Finally, with one last effort, she pulled the door open and reached for him. "Come on, lean on me." Somehow, through the haze of pain and confusion, James found the will to move. The woman wrapped an arm around him, her grip surprisingly strong, and together they stumbled away from the wreckage just as flames engulfed the car. The heat was unbearable, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. James collapsed on the wet pavement, gasping for breath. "Stay awake," the woman urged, kneeling beside him. "Help is on the way." James turned his head to look at her. For a moment, everything felt unreal. The rain, the smoke, the stranger who had saved his life. Who are you?" he managed to whisper. She smiled faintly, though her eyes reflected both relief and exhaustion. "Kayla, Kaida Haris." James' vision blurred again as the sound of sirens approached, but he held on to her name like a lifeline. Kaila Hadis. In the hospital days later, James found himself replaying the moment over and over. The flames, the stranger who had risked everything, and the look in her eyes, a look of unwavering determination. He owed her his life, and no amount of money or gratitude could repay that. When his assistant, Lily, brought him updates on his company's affairs, he barely listened. Instead, he said, "Find her. Find Kayla Harris. She's not easy to track down." "Sir," Lily replied after a few days, "but I did some digging. She's a schoolteacher on the South Side, works with underserved kids, volunteers at shelters, that sort of thing." James frowned, surprised. A teacher, a volunteer. The woman who had pulled him from the wreck wasn't someone seeking recognition or reward. She was someone who quietly gave herself to others. It was a stark contrast to the world James knew, a world of power and status, where every action had a price. He couldn't shake his need to see her again, to thank her properly. When he finally arranged a meeting, Kayla's reluctance was clear. She had agreed only after his assistant promised it was nothing formal, just lunch. A thank you. When James arrived at the small diner she'd chosen, dressed in his tailored suit, he felt entirely out of place. The room was warm and inviting, filled with the chatter of families and the clinking of silverware, so far removed from the high-rise world James inhabited. Kayla was already there, sitting at a corner table, her posture relaxed, but her gaze watchful. She wore a simple maroon blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. When she looked up and met his eyes, James felt that same unshakable sense of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he sat across from her. Kayla smiled softly. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble. Mr. Weston, I did what anyone would do." "No," James replied, his voice firm. "Not anyone would have done what you did. You saved my life." Kayla shrugged, though her expression grew more serious. "I couldn't just leave you there." As they spoke, James found himself drawn to her sincerity, her humility. Kayla didn't ask about his wealth or his business. Instead, she spoke about her students, her work at the shelter, and the challenges her community faced every day. She seemed so grounded, so sure of herself, and James couldn't help but admire her. For the first time in years, he felt like he was speaking to someone who truly saw him, not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man beneath it all. By the time their lunch ended, James knew one thing. His life had changed that day on the rain-soaked street, and Kayla Harris was at the center of it. Over the next few weeks, James Weston found himself thinking about Kayla Harris far more than he expected. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. Her world was one of service, sacrifice, and resilience so different from his own, where wealth and privilege defined every interaction. For years, James had surrounded himself with people who admired his success. But with Kayla, there were no illusions. She saw him as a man who'd been given a second chance. And strangely, he wanted to live up to that. At first, James' visits to Kayla were subtle. A donation to the school she taught at, boxes of supplies for her students, and gift cards to the shelter where she volunteered. Kayla, predictably, wasn't impressed. "You don't need to keep doing this," she told him one afternoon. Standing in the middle of her small classroom, sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting soft shadows across desks lined with crayon-stained papers and scribbled notebooks. "Gratitude doesn't come with strings." "James, it's not about gratitude," he replied honestly, hands stuffed in his coat pockets. I want to help. You've done so much for others. Someone should do something for you, too." Kayla studied him, her brown eyes sharp yet kind. "Then help because you care, not because you feel obligated. These kids, my students, they don't need charity. They need consistency. Someone who'll show up no matter what." Her words struck him harder than she could have known. For so long, James had believed he could solve anything with money. Money built schools, funded programs, and changed lives, or so he thought. But Kayla had shown him something deeper, the value of presence, of showing up, not because you should, but because you want to. And so he began to show up, not as the wealthy CEO everyone expected, but simply as James. On weekends, he joined Kayla and her students at the community center, listening as they shared their struggles, triumphs, and dreams. The first time he sat on the creaky gym floor, a handful of kids eyed him suspiciously, but Kayla had smiled, her approval enough to ease their doubts. Gradually, James grew into a different version of himself, one who wasn't constantly looking at the clock, calculating deals, or worrying about profit margins. He found satisfaction in the simplest moments, helping a teenager with his college essay, handing out sandwiches at the shelter, or watching Kayla laugh as she balanced a basketball on her fingertips, showing her students a trick. One evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the park where they often walked, Kayla opened up to him. "It's strange, isn't it?" she mused. "How life puts people in your path when you least expect it." James turned to look at her, hands deep in his coat pockets as they strolled down the gravel path. "I think you were exactly who I needed when I least expected it," he admitted softly. Kayla smiled faintly but didn't respond. Her silences spoke volumes, and James was learning to hear what was unspoken between them. There was a comfort in their quiet moments together, as though the chaos of the world couldn't touch them. Then, one evening, everything changed. James had just returned home after a long day when his phone buzzed with a call. It was Kayla. He answered quickly, hearing an unfamiliar strain in her voice. "James, I need to tell you something," she said hesitantly. "I don't know how else to say it, so I'll just come out with it." He could hear her take a steadying breath on the other end. "I'm pregnant, James, with twins." The word struck him like a thunderclap. Silence hung between them for a moment, but James' heart raced in his chest. "Twins." His voice finally broke the quiet. "Kayla, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her tone trembled slightly. "I've known for a few weeks, but I wasn't sure how to tell you. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did." James pressed his hand to his forehead, trying to process her words. Twins. After being told he could never have children, after believing his chance at a legacy had slipped through his fingers, here was Kayla, this woman who had already saved his life once, now carrying the beginnings of something he thought impossible. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked softly. Kayla hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want this to become something transactional. I'm prepared to raise them on my own. James, you don't owe me anything." But that's where she was wrong. James Weston owed her everything. "Kayla," he said firmly, his voice steady with emotion, "I'm not walking away. You saved me, twice now, it seems, and I'm not going to leave you to do this alone." Kayla's silence was telling. As though she didn't quite believe him, he couldn't blame her. Words were easy to say, actions were harder. And James knew that if he wanted her to trust him, he would have to prove that he was committed, not because of obligation, but because he wanted to be there. The weeks that followed tested both of them. James rearranged his life, carving time away from his endless responsibilities to be by Kayla's side. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, bought supplies she hadn't thought to ask for, and even spent quiet evenings in her small apartment reading about parenting twins. Kayla, independent as ever, resisted his efforts at first. "You don't need to keep showing up, James," she'd tell him with a teasing smile. "I can handle this." But he would simply reply, "I know you can, but you don't have to." Slowly, Kayla let her guard down, and together they began to prepare for the new life that awaited them. As her pregnancy progressed, James marveled at her strength. He watched her teach, volunteer, and manage the demands of carrying two lives with grace and quiet determination. One evening, as Kayla lay on the couch resting, James knelt beside her and placed his hand gently on her growing belly. "Do you feel the move yet?" he asked softly. Kayla smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Sometimes, usually at night when I'm trying to sleep." James chuckled, his voice tinged with awe. "I still can't believe it, twins." Kayla's expression softened. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "It does," he agreed, his gaze steady on her. "But I think this is the best surprise of all." In that moment, James knew that his life had irrevocably changed. The man who once believed his worth lay in wealth and power now found himself standing on the threshold of something far greater, a life of love, connection, and purpose. Kayla had given him a gift, one he hadn't even known he needed. And for that, he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was worthy of it. The morning of Kayla's due date arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. James Weston sat by the window in Kayla's small but cozy apartment, watching as the first light of dawn broke over the Chicago skyline. The city he once saw as nothing more than a symbol of his success now seemed different, less about what he had built and more about what he had found. The sound of Kayla shifting on the couch brought him back to the moment, and he turned to see her smiling softly despite the obvious discomfort. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice tired but full of warmth. "Not really," James admitted with a small grin, rubbing the back of his neck. "Nerves, I guess." Kayla chuckled lightly, though her expression softened as she looked at him. "It's not every day a man gets ready to meet his twins." "No," he agreed, moving to sit beside her. "But it's the best day I can imagine." Kayla leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment, her hand resting gently on her belly. "Do you ever think about how we ended up here? How unlikely it all feels?" James smiled, his voice low and reflective. "All the time, but I've learned that life doesn't always give you what you plan for. It gives you what you need." Kayla opened her eyes and looked at him, a small, knowing smile playing at her lips. "You've come a long way, Mr. Weston, and it's all because of you," he replied softly. "Because you believed in something bigger than just yourself. You taught me that true legacy isn't about money or power. It's about people, about showing up." The sincerity in his words brought tears to Kayla's eyes, though she blinked them away with a laugh. "Let's just get through today before we start thinking about legacies." James grinned, but before he could reply, Kayla gasped, gripping the armrest. "It's time," she whispered. The next hours passed in a blur. James remained by Kayla's side as they made their way to the hospital, his hand never leaving hers. Every contraction, every deep breath she took felt like a testament to her strength, a strength that humbled him beyond words. "You're doing amazing," he whispered in her ear when exhaustion threatened to overtake her. "I'm right here. We've got this." Kayla squeezed his hand tightly, drawing courage from his steady presence. For so long, she had been used to carrying burdens alone, but now she realized she didn't have to. James was here, not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. Hours later, the room filled with the unmistakable cries of new life. First one, then another, two tiny voices that seemed to fill the entire world with their arrival. Kayla collapsed against the bed, tears streaming down her face as she heard the sound of her daughters for the first time. James stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with shaky breaths as a nurse gently placed one swaddled baby into his arms. "Meet your daughter," she said softly. James looked down, his vision blurring with tears. The baby in his arms was impossibly small, her face pink and peaceful. She stretched her tiny hand, her fingers curling instinctively around his thumb. And at that moment, James felt something in him shift, something deep and unshakable. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. The second baby was placed into Kayla's arms, and for the first time, they looked at their daughters together. Kayla's smile was radiant despite her exhaustion, and as she looked up at James, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before: peace. "What should we name them?" Kayla asked softly. James gazed down at the babies, a warmth spreading through him. "How about Grace and Hope? That's what they've given me. Grace and Hope." Kayla's tears fell freely as she nodded. "Grace and Hope," she whispered. "It's perfect." In the days that followed, their lives changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. James, the once aloof billionaire, became a hands-on father overnight. He learned to change diapers, soothe crying babies, and rock his daughters to sleep in the stillness of the night. Every moment spent with them filled him with a joy that no amount of wealth had ever brought him. Kayla, too, found herself changing. The wall she had built so carefully around her heart began to crumble as she watched James embrace fatherhood with unwavering devotion. He wasn't the man she had saved from that wreckage months ago. He was someone entirely new. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to trust again. One evening, as Kayla stood in the doorway of the nursery, she watched James sitting in a rocking chair, holding grace and hope against his chest. He hummed softly, a tune she couldn't quite place, and the sight of him so at peace made her heart swell. "Never thought I'd see you like this," she teased gently. Stepping into the room, James looked up, a soft smile on his face. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I can't imagine being anywhere else." Kayla sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder as they looked down at their sleeping daughters. "Do you ever regret the life you left behind?" she asked quietly. James shook his head, his voice firm with conviction. "Not for a second. I thought legacy was something you left behind in the world. But I was wrong. It's not about buildings or wealth. It's about the love we give and the lives we touch. You taught me that." Kayla smiled, her voice soft. "And what about the future? What do you see?" James glanced at her, his expression tender. "I see us, this family we've built. I see grace and hope growing up surrounded by love, kindness, and strength. And I see us teaching them that true legacy comes from the heart." In that moment, Kayla realized that the man sitting beside her wasn't just a part of her life. He was her life. Together, they had created something beautiful out of unexpected beginnings. Years later, as grace and hope ran through the garden of their home, their laughter echoing through the air, James stood hand in hand with Kayla, watching them with pride. "This is everything I ever wanted," he said softly. Kayla smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "This is everything we needed." And in that quiet moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James Weston knew he had found the legacy he had once thought impossible, a family built on love, resilience, and the kind of unwavering devotion that could change the world. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of love, redemption, and the power of human connection. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more inspiring tales that touch the soul. Your support helps us continue to spread compassion and hope. Until next time, take care and treasure every moment with those you love. See you soon.